In the dead of winter, when snow covered the palace grounds like a white shroud, Princess Charlotte stood by her bedroom window, watching the world below. She had no idea that in less than an hour, her entire life would crumble like autumn leaves. The sound of heavy boots on marble floors would soon echo through the corridors, carrying news so devastating that it would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. What started as an ordinary Tuesday morning would become the day that tested everything Charlotte believed about duty, family, and survival. The royal guard approaching her door carried more than just news. He carried the weight of a secret that had been buried for 20 years, a truth so dangerous that it could destroy not just Charlotte's world, but the lives of everyone she held dear. Some stories begin with hope. This one begins with the sound of those boots, each step bringing Charlotte closer to a reality she never saw coming. A reality where being a princess meant nothing, where the crown she was born to wear might cost her everything she loved, and where the only person who could save her kingdom might be the one person she could never trust again. The guard's knock would come in 3 sharp raps. After that, nothing would ever be the same. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Princess Charlotte finished her breakfast in the private dining room. She had always preferred eating alone, away from the formal ceremonies and endless protocols that governed royal life. At 23, she had grown tired of the constant scrutiny, the careful words, and the weight of expectations that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Outside her window, the palace gardens stretched endlessly, perfectly manicured hedges forming intricate patterns that looked like green embroidery from her elevated view. Charlotte often wondered what lay beyond those walls, what life might be like for ordinary people who could walk freely without guards trailing behind them, who could speak their minds without considering the political implications of every word. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, bustled around the room, organizing papers and preparing Charlotte's schedule for the day. Margaret had been with the royal family for 15 years, arriving as a young woman fresh from the countryside and gradually becoming one of Charlotte's most trusted companions. She was one of the few people in the palace who treated Charlotte like a person rather than a symbol. "Your Highness," Margaret said, glancing at the ornate clock on the mantelpiece, "you have the Literacy Council meeting at 10, followed by the charity luncheon at noon. The ambassador from Westmont is expected at 3 for the trade discussions." Charlotte nodded absently, her mind elsewhere. These meetings felt increasingly meaningless to her, a series of carefully orchestrated performances where she smiled, nodded, and spoke words that had been written for her by advisors who never seemed to understand that she had thoughts and opinions of her own. "Margaret," Charlotte said suddenly, "do you ever wonder what would happen if we just left? If we walked out of here and never came back?" Margaret paused in her arranging, a concerned look crossing her weathered face. "Your Highness, you mustn't speak of such things. The palace has ears everywhere, and people might misunderstand your meaning." Charlotte stood and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. Below, she could see the palace guards making their morning rounds, their red uniforms bright against the white snow that had fallen overnight. Everything looked peaceful, orderly, exactly as it should be in a well-run kingdom. But Charlotte had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. Behind the perfect facade of palace life, she had glimpsed the complex web of politics, betrayal, and hidden agendas that really governed her world. She had seen how quickly smiles could turn to frowns when people thought she wasn't looking, how conversations stopped when she entered a room, how even her closest advisors sometimes exchanged glances that suggested they knew things she did not. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside made both women turn toward the door. The steps were heavy, purposeful, unlike the usual soft shuffle of servants or the measured pace of palace officials. These were the boots of someone who carried urgent news. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the room. "Enter," Charlotte called, smoothing her dress and assuming the composed posture that had been drilled into her since childhood. The door opened to reveal Captain William Hayes, the head of the Royal Guard. He was a man in his 40s with graying hair and a face marked by years of service and difficult decisions. Charlotte had known him since she was a child, and she had never seen him look as grave as he did in this moment. "Your Highness," he said, bowing formally, "apologize for the interruption, but I bring urgent news from the northern border." Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. News from the northern border was never good. That region had been troubled for months, with reports of unrest and strange disappearances that the official reports had downplayed. "Please, Captain Hayes, speak freely," Charlotte said, gesturing for him to continue. Margaret quietly stepped back, but Charlotte noticed that the captain glanced at her uncertainly. "Perhaps this conversation would be better held in private." "Your Highness," he suggested. "Margaret has been with our family for 15 years, Charlotte replied firmly. "She has my complete trust." Captain Hayes nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Your Highness, 3 days ago, a messenger arrived from Lord Pemberton's estate near Millbrook. The message was disturbing. He reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed letter, its edges darkened as if it had been exposed to fire or smoke. The royal seal was partially melted, giving the document an ominous appearance. Lord Pemberton reports that entire villages in his region have been abandoned overnight. The people simply vanished, leaving behind their belongings, their animals, everything. But that's not the strangest part. Charlotte took the letter, her hands trembling slightly as she broke what remained of the seal. The handwriting inside was shaky, desperate, unlike Lord Pemberton's usual careful script. "He says the missing people left behind something else," Captain Hayes continued. "Messages, warnings, all of them saying the same thing. The past has come to claim its due." As Charlotte read the letter, her face grew pale. The words seemed to swim before her eyes, each sentence more disturbing than the last. Lord Pemberton described empty houses with meals still warm on the tables, children's toys scattered in yards where no children played, animals left unfed and crying in their pens. But it was the final paragraph that made Charlotte's blood run cold. "Your Highness, I fear these disappearances are connected to events from 20 years past. I have discovered documents hidden in my family's archives that speak of a debt that was never paid, a promise that was broken. The people who have vanished all share one thing in common. Their families were involved in the construction of a new palace wing during your father's early reign. I believe someone is collecting on an old agreement, and I fear the royal family may be their ultimate target." Charlotte read the paragraph twice, her mind racing. 20 years ago, she had been only 3 years old when the new palace wing was built. She had no memory of any controversy surrounding the construction, no knowledge of any agreements or promises made during that time. "Captain Hayes," she said, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. "What do you know about the palace construction from 20 years ago?" The captain's jaw tightened. "Your Highness, that was before my time as head of the guard, but I've heard whispers. The construction was completed unusually quickly, and there were rumors of unconventional methods used to ensure the workers' cooperation." "What kind of methods?" "I'm afraid I don't have reliable information, Your Highness. But there were stories about agreements made in secret, about promises that were meant to be kept after the work was done. Promises that, according to the rumors, were never honored." Charlotte handed the letter to Margaret, who read it quickly, her face growing increasingly worried. "Your Highness," Margaret said softly, "my father was a stonemason. He worked on the palace construction." Both Charlotte and Captain Hayes turned to stare at her. Margaret had never mentioned this before, and Charlotte felt a stab of hurt that her trusted friend had kept this information from her. "Margaret, why didn't you ever tell me?" Charlotte asked. "Because my father made me promise never to speak of it," Margaret replied, tears forming in her eyes. "He said the work they did there was meant to be forgotten, that speaking of it would bring danger to our family." "What kind of work?" Captain Hayes demanded, his hand instinctively moving toward his sword. Margaret looked between them, clearly torn between her old promise and her loyalty to Charlotte. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They weren't just building a palace wing, Your Highness. They were sealing something beneath it, something that was supposed to stay buried forever." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock and the distant sound of wind rattling the windows. Charlotte felt as if the world had shifted beneath her feet, as if everything she thought she knew about her home, her family, and her life had suddenly become uncertain. "Captain Hayes," she said, trying to keep her voice calm and authoritative, "I want you to send riders to every estate in the northern region. I want a full report on any disappearances, any strange occurrences, anything out of the ordinary. And I want to speak with anyone who was involved in the palace construction 20 years ago. Your Highness, with respect, perhaps we should inform the king and Queen before taking such drastic action," the captain suggested. Charlotte considered this. Her parents were currently traveling in the southern provinces, inspecting the coastal defenses. They wouldn't return for another week. By then, if Lord Pemberton's fears were correct, it might be too late. "My parents are too far away to be consulted quickly," Charlotte decided. "As heir to the throne, I'm authorized to take emergency action to protect the kingdom's interests. Please carry out my orders immediately." Captain Hayes bowed. "As you wish, Your Highness. But I must insist on doubling the palace guard until we understand what we're dealing with." "Agreed. And Captain, I want this kept quiet for now. If word spreads that the royal family might be in danger, it could cause panic throughout the kingdom." After the captain left, Charlotte slumped into her chair, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She looked at Margaret, who was still pale with shock. "Margaret, I need you to tell me everything your father said about the palace construction. Everything, no matter how strange or frightening it might sound." Margaret nodded slowly. "He told me that they were hired not just as builders, but as guardians. They were sworn to secrecy about what lay beneath the foundation they were covering. He said it was something ancient, something that had been buried there long before the first palace was ever built." "What kind of something?" "He never said exactly, but he told me that the old palace had been built in that location specifically because it was a place of power where the boundaries between worlds were thin. The new wing wasn't just an addition to the palace. It was a reinforcement meant to strengthen the barriers that kept that power contained." Charlotte felt a chill that went deeper than the winter cold. And if those barriers were to fail, Margaret met her eyes, her expression grave. "My father said that would be the end of everything we know, that the old powers would reclaim what was once theirs, no matter who stood in their way." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with increasing violence. Charlotte looked out at the gardens, which suddenly seemed less like a peaceful retreat and more like a carefully maintained illusion hiding something far more dangerous beneath. The comfortable world she had always known was beginning to crack, and through those cracks, she could see glimpses of a reality far stranger and more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined. The disappearances in the north were just the beginning. Something was stirring beneath the palace, something that had been waiting 20 years for its chance to emerge. And Charlotte was beginning to understand that she might be the only one who could stop it. That evening, Charlotte found herself unable to concentrate on the state dinner being held in honor of visiting dignitaries from the Eastern Kingdoms. The grand dining hall glittered with candlelight reflecting off crystal and silver, and the conversation flowed around topics of trade agreements and diplomatic marriages, but Charlotte's mind kept returning to Margaret's revelations and the disturbing letter from Lord Pemberton. She watched the faces around the table, nobles she had known all her life, advisors who had served her family for decades, guests whose families had allied with hers for generations. Did any of them know what lay beneath the palace? Had any of them been part of whatever conspiracy had led to the construction of the new wing 20 years ago? Duke Harrison, her father's oldest advisor, was seated to her right, regaling the table with stories of successful harvests and peaceful negotiations with neighboring kingdoms. He had been instrumental in planning the palace expansion, Charlotte remembered. He would have been intimately involved in every aspect of the construction. Duke Harrison, Charlotte said during a lull in the conversation, I've been reading some of the old palace records. The construction of the new wing 20 years ago was quite remarkable, wasn't it? Completed so quickly and efficiently. The Duke's smile never wavered, but Charlotte caught a brief flicker in his eyes, a momentary hesitation before he replied. Indeed, Your Highness. Your father was most eager to see the project completed. We were fortunate to find such dedicated workers. And they were all local craftsmen? Charlotte pressed. For the most part, yes. Though we did bring in some specialists from the northern regions. Men who understood particular techniques that were needed for the foundation work. Charlotte noticed that several other advisors had stopped their own conversations to listen. The table had grown quieter, though the visitors from the Eastern Kingdoms seemed unaware of any tension. What kind of techniques? Charlotte asked, keeping her tone light and curious rather than suspicious. Duke Harrison's weathered hands tightened almost imperceptibly around his wine glass. Oh, you know how these old buildings can be, Your Highness? Sometimes they're built on unstable ground, and special methods are required to ensure proper support. Quite technical, really. Nothing that would interest someone of your refined sensibilities. It was a dismissal, politely worded but clear in its intent. Charlotte smiled and nodded, allowing the conversation to move on to safer topics. But she filed away every detail of the Duke's discomfort. After the dinner concluded and the guests had retired to their chambers, Charlotte made her way through the palace corridors with Margaret at her side. The familiar halls seemed different now, as if the very walls were hiding secrets from her. Every shadow looked deeper. Every portrait of her ancestors seemed to watch her with knowing eyes. Margaret, Charlotte said quietly as they walked, do you know where your father worked specifically during the construction? Which part of the foundation? He mentioned the East Wing basement, Margaret replied. He said they spent weeks working in chambers that had never seen sunlight, rooms that existed beneath the original palace structure. I want to see those chambers. Margaret stopped walking, her face pale in the flickering torchlight. Your Highness, surely that's not wise. If my father's stories were true, if there really is something dangerous sealed down there, then I need to know what it is, Charlotte said firmly. Whatever is happening in the northern provinces, whatever caused those people to disappear, it's connected to this palace. I can feel it. They made their way to the East Wing, descending stone stairs that Charlotte had never bothered to explore before. The air grew colder as they went deeper, and their footsteps echoed strangely in the narrow passages. Margaret carried a lantern, its warm light creating dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls. The basement level was a maze of storage rooms and forgotten chambers. Charlotte had always assumed they were simply used for keeping supplies and housing the palace's mechanical systems. But as they explored deeper, they found rooms that seemed to serve no practical purpose at all. One chamber was perfectly round, with intricate symbols carved into the stone floor. The symbols were unlike anything Charlotte had ever seen, neither the common script used in her kingdom nor any foreign language she recognized. They seemed to form a complex pattern radiating out from the center of the room, where a large stone slab was set into the floor. "This is it," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "My father described this room exactly. He said this was where they worked the longest and where they were sworn to the strongest secrecy." Charlotte knelt beside the stone slab, running her fingers over its surface. It was smooth and cold, but as she touched it, she could swear she felt a faint vibration, as if something beneath was stirring in response to her presence. "Help me move this," she said to Margaret. "Your Highness, please. We shouldn't disturb whatever was meant to stay sealed." But Charlotte was already pushing against one edge of the stone slab. It was heavy, but not immovable. With Margaret's reluctant help, they managed to slide it aside, revealing a dark opening that led down into the earth beneath the palace. A musty smell rose from the opening, carrying with it something else, a scent that reminded Charlotte of old books and dried flowers, but with an underlying note of something far less pleasant. The darkness below seemed to swallow their lantern light, giving no hint of how deep the passage might go. "I'm going down," Charlotte announced. "No," Margaret said firmly, grabbing Charlotte's arm. "I won't let you. If something happens to you down there, if you're hurt or worse, how would I explain it to their majesties? How would I live with myself?" Charlotte paused, touched by Margaret's concern but not deterred. "Then come with me. We'll face whatever's down there together." Margaret's grip loosened, and Charlotte could see the internal struggle playing out on her friend's face. Finally, Margaret sighed in defeat. "If we're going to do this foolish thing, at least let me go first. I've heard my father's stories. I might have some idea of what to expect." They descended carefully, using handholds carved into the stone walls. The passage was narrow but well-constructed, clearly the work of skilled craftsmen. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, they reached a larger chamber. Margaret held the lantern high, and Charlotte gasped at what the light revealed. The chamber was enormous, far larger than should have been possible given the palace structure above. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols they had seen upstairs, but here they were painted rather than carved, and they seemed to glow faintly with their own light. The floor was made of polished black stone that reflected their images like still water. But it was the center of the chamber that made Charlotte's heart race with fear and fascination. A circular pool of water sat perfectly still, so clear that she couldn't tell how deep it might be. Around the pool's edge, dozens of stone statues stood in a circle, each one depicting a figure in robes with their hands raised as if in prayer or supplication. "My father told me about this," Margaret whispered. "He said the workers weren't just sealing something away, they were maintaining a balance. These statues, this pool, they're part of some kind of ancient system that keeps the old powers dormant." Charlotte walked closer to the pool, drawn by something she couldn't name. The water was so still it looked like a sheet of glass. But as she approached, she began to see movement beneath the surface. Not ripples or waves, but shapes, shadowy forms that seemed to swim in the depths. "The disappearances in the north," Charlotte said suddenly, pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place in her mind. "What if they're not random? What if the people being taken are the descendants of the workers who built this place? Margaret's face went white. You mean they're being collected? Punished for their ancestors' part in this sealing. Or maybe they're being used, Charlotte said grimly. Maybe whatever's down here needs them for something. Needs their blood, their life force, to break free from whatever bindings were put in place. As if responding to her words, the water in the pool began to stir. The shadowy forms beneath the surface moved more quickly, rising toward the top. Charlotte backed away, but not before she caught a glimpse of what lurked in the depths. They were faces, human faces, but wrong in ways that made her mind recoil from understanding them fully. Some had too many eyes, others had mouths that opened far too wide. They pressed against the undersurface of the pool like prisoners against glass, their expressions full of rage and desperate hunger. "We need to leave," Margaret said urgently. "Now!" But as they turned toward the passage they had come from, they heard something that made them freeze. Footsteps. Someone else was descending into the chamber. Charlotte quickly extinguished Margaret's lantern, plunging them into darkness broken only by the faint glow of the symbols on the walls. They crept behind one of the larger statues, holding their breath and trying to remain perfectly still. The footsteps reached the bottom of the passage, and a new light entered the chamber. Charlotte peered around the statue and saw Duke Harrison approaching the pool, carrying a torch in one hand and what appeared to be an ancient book in the other. He was not alone. 3 other figures followed him, people Charlotte didn't recognize, dressed in dark robes with hoods pulled up to hide their faces. They moved with the careful precision of people performing a ritual they had practiced many times. Duke Harrison opened the book and began to read in a language that sounded like nothing Charlotte had ever heard. The words seemed to echo strangely in the chamber, bouncing off the walls and growing louder rather than fading away. As he spoke, the water in the pool began to glow with a pale, sickly light. The faces beneath the surface became more active, pressing harder against whatever barrier kept them trapped. Some of them began to speak, their voices rising from the pool in harmonies that made Charlotte's skin crawl. They were calling someone's name over and over. It took Charlotte several moments to realize whose name they were speaking. Charlotte. 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 The princess felt Margaret's hand grip her arm so tightly it was painful, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene unfolding before them. Duke Harrison was conducting some kind of ceremony, and it was clearly connected to her personally. One of the robed figures approached the pool's edge and began to pour something into the water, a red liquid that Charlotte feared was blood. As the substance mixed with the pool water, the voices from below grew louder and more insistent. "The barriers weaken," Duke Harrison said, closing the book. "The time approaches when the old agreements must be honored. The princess carries the bloodline that bound them. Only her willing sacrifice can renew the seals for another generation." "And if she refuses?" asked one of the robed figures. "Then they will break free regardless, and the kingdom will fall to chaos. But if she accepts her destiny, if she takes her place in the pool as her bloodline demands, then balance will be maintained." Charlotte's mind reeled. They were talking about sacrificing her, not just killing her, but using her somehow to maintain whatever supernatural prison existed beneath the palace. Her own family, the advisor she had trusted, they had all been part of a conspiracy that stretched back generations. But how far back? How long had the royal bloodline been bound to this terrible responsibility? How many of her ancestors had faced this same choice? The ceremony continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The voices from the pool grew louder and more desperate, and Charlotte began to understand fragments of what they were saying. They spoke of freedom, of hunger, of revenge against those who had bound them. They spoke of the northern villages as merely the beginning, a taste of the chaos they would unleash if they were fully freed. Finally, Duke Harrison and his companions concluded their ritual and began to leave. Charlotte and Margaret remained hidden until they were certain the chamber was empty, then crept quietly back to the passage entrance. As they climbed back toward the palace proper, Charlotte's mind raced with the implications of what they had witnessed. She was trapped in a nightmare that her own family had helped create, surrounded by people who saw her not as a person, but as a tool to maintain some ancient and terrible balance. But knowledge, she realized, could be power. Now that she understood what she was facing, she could begin to formulate a plan. She might be trapped by the circumstances of her birth, but she wasn't helpless. The question was whether she could find a way to break the cycle without dooming her kingdom to the chaos that the things in the pool promised to unleash. When they finally emerged into the familiar corridors of the palace, Charlotte felt as if she was seeing everything with new eyes. The beautiful tapestries, the elegant furniture, the portraits of noble ancestors, all of it was built on a foundation of secrets and supernatural horror. She was no longer just a princess preparing to inherit a throne. She was the latest link in a chain of sacrifice that stretched back through generations, and she had very little time to decide whether she would accept that fate or find a way to break free from it entirely. The next morning brought news that made Charlotte's blood run cold. Captain Hayes arrived at her private study with reports from the northern provinces that painted a picture of escalating horror. 3 more villages had been found completely abandoned overnight, but this time there were signs of struggle. Houses were torn apart from the inside. Captain Hayes reported, his usually steady voice betraying strain. Furniture overturned, walls clawed as if by massive hands. But still no bodies, no blood, nothing to indicate what happened to the people. Charlotte listened while pretending to review morning correspondence, but her mind was elsewhere. The ceremony she had witnessed the night before replayed in her memory, particularly Duke Harrison's words about the barriers weakening. Whatever forces were contained beneath the palace were growing stronger, and the disappearances were clearly their work. "Has there been any word from my parents?" Charlotte asked, though she already knew the answer. The royal carriage was expected in the coastal city of Seaforth yesterday, Your Highness, but no word has arrived. The weather has been severe in the southern provinces. Most likely they're simply delayed. But Charlotte no longer believed in simple explanations. If the entities beneath the palace were growing bolder, if they were actively working to break free from their ancient prison, then her parents might be in danger as well. Or worse, they might already be part of whatever conspiracy was unfolding. After Captain Hayes left, Charlotte found herself alone with thoughts that grew darker by the hour. She needed to understand more about her family's history, about the true nature of the bargain that had been struck generations ago. The palace library would have records, genealogies, historical documents that might shed light on the supernatural burden her bloodline carried. But she couldn't risk going alone. If Duke Harrison or his allies suspected that she knew about the chamber beneath the palace, her life could be in immediate danger. She needed help from someone she could trust completely. Margaret was the obvious choice, but Charlotte realized that her friend's family connection to the palace construction made her vulnerable as well. If the entities below were collecting the descendants of the original workers, then Margaret might be next on their list. There was, however, someone else who might have answers. Charlotte remembered stories about her great-aunt Isabel, her grandfather's sister who had left the palace decades ago to become a scholar. Family whispers suggested that Isabel had uncovered some troubling information about the royal bloodline and had chosen exile rather than remain complicit in whatever secrets she had discovered. If Isabel was still alive, she would be living in the old monastery at Grey Rock, about a day's ride from the palace. It was a risk to leave the palace grounds without a full escort, especially given the recent disappearances, but Charlotte felt she had no choice. She needed answers that couldn't be found within the palace walls. She spent the morning making arrangements, telling her staff that she felt the need for spiritual contemplation and would be visiting the monastery for prayer and reflection. It was plausible enough. Many members of the royal family had made similar journeys during times of stress or uncertainty. Captain Hayes was reluctant to allow her to travel with only a small guard detail, but Charlotte insisted that a large procession would defeat the purpose of a spiritual retreat. She agreed to take 4 guards and Margaret, which was the minimum he would accept for her safety. They departed just after noon, riding through the palace gates and into the winter countryside. Charlotte had always loved riding, but today she found no joy in the freedom of the open road. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The journey to Grey Rock took them through several small villages that showed signs of the growing unrest in the kingdom. People watched their procession pass with suspicious eyes, and Charlotte noticed that many houses had new protective charms hanging from their doors and windows, iron horseshoes, bundles of herbs, symbols she didn't recognize but that clearly carried spiritual significance for the local people. "They're afraid," Margaret observed quietly as they rode through one particularly tense village. "They have good reason to be," Charlotte replied. "The disappearances aren't the only strange things happening. People can sense when something is wrong, even if they don't understand what it is." As afternoon faded into evening, they finally reached the monastery at Grey Rock. The ancient stone building sat perched on a hillside, overlooking a valley that had once been the site of some forgotten battle. The monastery itself was old even by the standards of Charlotte's kingdom, built centuries before the first palace had been erected. The monks who greeted them were surprised, but welcoming. Word of Charlotte's arrival was sent to the abbess, and within minutes, Charlotte found herself face to face with her great-aunt for the first time in over a decade. Isabel had aged gracefully, her hair silver white, but her eyes still sharp with intelligence. She wore the simple brown robes of the monastic order, but Charlotte could see traces of the royal bearing that had never quite been suppressed by years of religious contemplation. "Charlotte," Isabel said, embracing her niece warmly, "you've grown into a beautiful woman, but there's trouble in your eyes. What brings you to seek me out after all these years?" They retired to Isabel's private chambers, where Charlotte poured out everything that had happened over the past few days. She told her great-aunt about the disappearances, about Margaret's father's stories, about the chamber beneath the palace, and the terrifying ritual she had witnessed. Isabel listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. When Charlotte finished speaking, the older woman was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire that burned in her chamber's small hearth. "I had hoped this day would never come," Isabel finally said. "I had hoped that the seals would hold for another generation, that perhaps my brother's children would be spared the choice that has haunted our family for so long." "Then, you know about the entities beneath the palace?" "I know the whole terrible history," Isabel confirmed. "I spent years researching our family's past, digging through archives, and seeking out the few remaining records of what really happened when the first palace was built. What I discovered was so horrifying that I knew I could never be complicit in perpetuating it." Isabel rose and went to a locked chest in the corner of her chamber. From it, she withdrew a collection of old books and documents, some so ancient that their pages crumbled at the edges. Our family's connection to the entities beneath the palace goes back 12 generations. She began, opening one of the books to a page covered with genealogical charts. The first King Edmund didn't choose the palace site randomly. He was guided there by advisors who knew exactly what lay buried in that ground. "What are they?" Charlotte asked. "The things in the chamber? They're older than human civilization," Isabel replied. "Some scholars call them the first ones. Others refer to them as the Hungry Dark. They existed long before humans walked this land, and they ruled through power we can barely comprehend. But they were defeated, eventually, by a coalition of the earliest human settlements working together with knowledge they had gained from sources we can only guess at." She turned to another page, showing Charlotte an illustration that made her stomach turn. It depicted creatures that were vaguely humanoid, but wrong in fundamental ways. Beings with multiple faces, limbs that bent in impossible directions, eyes that seemed to look directly out from a page. The first ones couldn't be destroyed, only contained. The prison that holds them requires a very specific type of spiritual energy to maintain, energy that can only be provided by someone who shares the bloodline of their original captors. So every generation, someone from my family, every generation, someone must choose, Isabel corrected gently. The choice your grandfather faced, that your father will eventually face, and that you're facing now. Enter the pool willingly and provide the spiritual anchor that keeps the first ones contained, or risk their escape and the end of human civilization as we know it. Charlotte felt the weight of centuries settling on her shoulders. Is there no other way? No way to break the cycle? Isabel was quiet for a moment, then pulled out one final document. This one was different from the others, newer, written in modern script rather than ancient text. "I spent 20 years searching for an alternative," she said, "and I found possibilities, theoretical approaches that might work. But they would require sacrifices almost as terrible as the current situation." "What kind of sacrifices?" "The first ones draw their power from human fear and despair. They feed on suffering and chaos. If their prison were to be permanently destroyed rather than simply maintained, it would require an act of such profound spiritual clarity and selflessness that it would fundamentally alter the balance between light and darkness in our world." Charlotte studied the document, trying to understand the complex diagrams and mystical formulas it contained. "You mean someone would still have to die?" "Perhaps not die," Isabel said carefully. "But they would have to give up everything that makes them human. They would have to become something else entirely, a permanent guardian, neither alive nor dead, existing in a state of eternal sacrifice to ensure that the first ones remain powerless." "That's not much better than the current arrangement, isn't it? Instead of requiring a new sacrifice every generation, it would require only one final, ultimate sacrifice. The cycle would end forever." Charlotte absorbed this information, her mind racing with the implications. She could maintain the status quo, enter the pool as her ancestors had done, and buy humanity another generation of safety. Or she could attempt something far more dangerous that might end the threat forever, but would almost certainly cost her everything she was. "There's something else you need to know," Isabel continued. "The recent disappearances, the weakening of the barriers, this isn't happening by accident. Someone is actively working to free the first ones, someone with knowledge of the ancient rituals and access to the palace. The ceremony you witnessed was likely part of a larger plan." "Duke Harrison," Charlotte said grimly. "But why would he want to free them? What could he possibly gain?" "Power," Isabel replied simply. The first ones have made promises to their human servants throughout the centuries. They offer knowledge, longevity, abilities beyond normal human understanding. Some people are willing to risk the destruction of civilization for personal gain. Charlotte felt a chill of understanding. He's not trying to maintain the seals at all. He's trying to weaken them. The ritual I saw wasn't meant to keep the first ones contained. It was meant to help them escape. And if he succeeds, if the first ones break free before the next royal sacrifice is made, then nothing will be able to stop them. They'll be free to reclaim the world they once ruled, and humanity will become nothing more than cattle for creatures that view suffering as entertainment. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting shifting shadows on the walls that reminded Charlotte uncomfortably of the shapes she had seen moving beneath the surface of the pool. She was trapped between impossible choices, facing forces that had been manipulating her family for centuries. But she was also armed with knowledge that previous generations hadn't possessed. She understood the true nature of the threat, and she had at least the possibility of an alternative to the endless cycle of sacrifice that had defined her bloodline. "Aunt Isabel," she said finally, "if I were to attempt this permanent solution you described, what would I need to do?" Isabel's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "You would need to return to the palace, gather the specific items and knowledge required for the ritual, and then descend into the chamber at the moment when the barriers are weakest. You would have to face the first ones directly, not as a sacrifice to maintain their prison, but as a challenger seeking to destroy it entirely. And the chances of success? I don't know," Isabel admitted. "The theoretical foundation is sound, but it's never been attempted. You would be venturing into territory that no human has ever explored before." Charlotte nodded slowly. It wasn't much of a choice, really. She could surrender herself to maintain an ancient evil, or she could risk everything in an attempt to end the threat forever. Either way, her life, as she had known it, was over. But if she had to sacrifice herself, she would do it on her own terms, in a way that might actually free future generations from the curse that had haunted her family for centuries. The only question now was whether she could return to the palace and complete the preparations before Duke Harrison's conspiracy succeeded in freeing the first ones ahead of schedule. Charlotte and her small party rode through the night, pushing their horses harder than was safe on the dark winter roads. Isabel had provided her with a leather satchel containing the ancient texts and ritual materials she would need for the permanent binding ceremony. But every mile they traveled brought fresh evidence that time was running out. The first sign of trouble came when they reached the village of Millbrook, the same settlement mentioned in Lord Pemberton's letter. What they found there defied rational explanation. The entire village square had been transformed into something resembling an ancient temple. The buildings around the perimeter stood empty, their doors and windows gaping black in the moonlight, but the cobblestones of the square itself had been arranged in intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. Symbols were carved into every surface, not painted or etched, but carved as if the stone itself had been soft as clay when the work was done. At the center of the square stood a massive stone altar that definitely hadn't been there when Charlotte had passed through the village on her way to the monastery. The altar was stained with something dark that reflected the moonlight like oil, and the air around it shimmered with heat despite the winter cold. "Your Highness," whispered one of her guards, "we should not linger here. This place feels wrong." Charlotte agreed, but she couldn't resist dismounting to examine the altar more closely. The stone was covered with the same symbols she had seen in the chamber beneath the palace, but these were larger, more elaborate, and they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Margaret appeared at her side, holding a torch high. "Princess, look at this." She was pointing to a series of marks carved into the side of the altar. At first glance, they appeared to be more mystical symbols, but as Charlotte studied them, she realized they were actually names. Dozens of names, carved in neat rows that covered nearly every inch of the altar surface. "These are the people who disappeared," Charlotte breathed, recognizing several names from the reports Captain Hayes had shown her. "But why are their names here? What happened to them?" As if in answer to her question, a sound drifted across the empty village, a low humming that seemed to come from beneath the ground itself. The symbols on the altar began to glow brighter, and Charlotte felt a pulling sensation, as if something was trying to draw her toward the stone. "We need to leave," she said urgently, backing away from the altar. "Now!" They remounted quickly and rode hard for the palace, but the humming sound followed them, growing louder rather than fading with distance. By the time they reached the palace gates, the sound was so intense that their horses were nearly mad with fear, rolling their eyes and dancing sideways despite their riders' attempts to control them. The palace guards who admitted them were clearly relieved to see Charlotte return safely, but their relief was mixed with obvious anxiety. "Your Highness," said the gate captain, "Duke Harrison has been asking for your whereabouts. He seemed most insistent that he speak with you immediately upon your return." Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Did he say what about?" "No, Your Highness, but he's been in conference with several other nobles since yesterday evening. They've requested the use of the Great Hall for some sort of ceremony tonight." "What kind of ceremony?" "They called it a prayer service for the safety of the northern provinces, Your Highness, to ask for divine protection against whatever evil forces might be causing the disappearances." Charlotte exchanged a meaningful glance with Margaret. A prayer service involving Duke Harrison and his allies was almost certainly not what it appeared to be. "Captain," Charlotte said carefully, "I want you to double the guard around my quarters tonight. I'm feeling unwell from the journey, and don't wish to be disturbed by anyone for any reason." "Of course, Your Highness. Shall I inform Duke Harrison that you've returned?" "No," Charlotte said quickly. "Let him believe I'm still away. I'll speak with him tomorrow when I'm feeling better." They made their way quickly to Charlotte's quarters, where she immediately began studying the materials Isabel had given her. The ritual for permanently binding the first ones was complex, requiring specific components and precise timing. Most importantly, it had to be performed at the moment when the existing barriers were at their weakest, which, according to Isabel's research, would be during the new moon, just 3 days away. But as Charlotte read through the ancient texts, she realized that Duke Harrison's prayer service might force her hand much sooner than she had planned. "Listen to this," she said to Margaret, reading from one of Isabel's books. "The barriers that contain the first ones can be deliberately weakened by rituals performed by those who know the proper incantations. These rituals typically require offerings of blood and fear, preferably from individuals connected to the original binding." Blood and fear from people connected to the original binding, Margaret repeated slowly. "You mean the descendants of the workers who built the palace?" "Exactly. The people who've been disappearing weren't taken randomly. They were harvested for their spiritual energy, their connection to the ancient magic that holds the first ones in place." Charlotte continued reading, her face growing pale. "But the final step, the ritual that actually breaks the barriers completely, requires something more. It requires the willing participation of someone from the royal bloodline, someone who would normally serve as the sacrifice to maintain the seals. Duke Harrison is planning to trick you," Margaret realized. "The prayer service tonight, he's going to try to get you to participate in the ritual that frees the first ones probably by disguising it as something innocent. Charlotte nodded grimly. Which means we can't wait 3 days for the new moon. If I'm going to attempt the permanent binding, it has to be tonight, before Duke Harrison can complete his betrayal. She gathered the ritual materials, ancient candles made from beeswax and human hair, vials of water from sacred springs, a blade forged from meteorite iron, and, most importantly, a small crystal pendant that Isabel claimed contained a fragment of the original binding spell. "What can I do to help?" Margaret asked. "You can't come with me," Charlotte said firmly. "This is something I have to do alone. If the ritual goes wrong, if I fail, then you need to escape the palace and warn the outside world about what's coming. I'm not leaving you to face this by yourself. Margaret, you have to understand, if I fail tonight, if the first ones break free, then everything ends. Every human being in this kingdom, possibly in the world, will be at the mercy of creatures that view torture as entertainment. You're the only person left who knows the truth about what's really happening." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded reluctantly. "How will I know if you succeeded? If the palace is still standing in the morning, if the ground doesn't split open and release horrors beyond imagination, then you'll know I found a way." As evening approached, Charlotte could hear the sounds of preparation echoing through the palace corridors. Duke Harrison's prayer service was clearly going to be an elaborate affair, with chanting and ceremonial processions that would mask the true nature of what was being performed. Charlotte waited until full darkness had fallen, then made her way carefully through the palace toward the east wing. She had to avoid the main corridors where Duke Harrison's ceremony was taking place, taking a circuitous route through servant passages and rarely used stairs. But as she approached the entrance to the chamber beneath the palace, she realized she wasn't alone. Figures in dark robes were positioned throughout the east wing, standing guard or perhaps participating in some larger ritual pattern. She could hear chanting coming from multiple directions, as if the entire palace had been transformed into a massive ceremonial space. Moving carefully from shadow to shadow, Charlotte finally reached the hidden entrance to the chamber. The stone slab had been moved aside, and a pale, sickly light was emanating from the opening below. The chanting was much louder here, echoing up from the depths with harmonies that made her teeth ache. She descended quickly, her heart pounding with fear and determination. The chamber below had been transformed since her last visit. Dozens of candles now lined the walls, their flames an unnatural blue-white color that cast everything in stark, disturbing relief. The pool at the center of the chamber was no longer still. It bubbled and churned as if something massive was stirring in its depths. Duke Harrison stood at the pool's edge along with at least 20 robed figures, all chanting in the same ancient language Charlotte had heard during the ritual she had witnessed before. But this was clearly the culmination of their efforts, not a preparatory ceremony. As Charlotte watched from the entrance, one of the robed figures approached the pool carrying a large vessel filled with dark liquid. When the contents were poured into the churning water, the entire chamber shook as if from an earthquake. The voices from beneath the surface of the pool grew louder, no longer the desperate whispers Charlotte remembered, but triumphant roars of approaching freedom. The water began to glow with the same sickly light that emanated from the symbols on the walls, and cracks appeared in the stone floor around the pool's edge. Charlotte realized that she might already be too late. The barriers were breaking down faster than anyone had anticipated. In minutes, perhaps less, the first ones would be free to emerge from their ancient prison. She pulled out the ritual materials Isabel had given her, trying to remember the precise order of steps needed for the permanent binding. But as she prepared to descend into the chamber, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Her own name being chanted by Duke Harrison and his followers. Charlotte of the royal blood, Charlotte of the binding line. Come to us, come to your destiny, complete the circle that frees the first ones from their earthly chains. They knew she was there. Somehow, they had sensed her presence and were calling her down to participate in the very ritual she was hoping to prevent. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and Charlotte felt a compulsion building in her mind, an almost irresistible urge to walk down into the chamber and take her place at the pool's edge. It was as if the first ones themselves were reaching out to her, using their growing power to cloud her judgment and bend her will to their purposes. She gripped Isabel's crystal pendant so tightly that its edges cut into her palm, using the physical pain to maintain her focus. She had one chance to complete the permanent binding ritual, but she would have to do it while surrounded by enemies who were actively working to free the very entities she was trying to contain. The chamber shook again, more violently this time. Cracks spread across the ceiling, and dust rained down like snow. In the pool, something vast and dark was rising toward the surface, and Charlotte could see tendrils of shadow beginning to emerge from the churning water. Time had run out. Whatever she was going to do, she had to do it now. Taking a deep breath, Charlotte stepped out from her hiding place and began to descend into the chamber. Not as the willing sacrifice Duke Harrison expected, but as something far more dangerous, a young woman with nothing left to lose and the knowledge to end a curse that had haunted her family for 12 generations. Charlotte stepped into the chamber with her head held high, every inch the royal princess she had been raised to be. Duke Harrison and his robed followers turned toward her with expressions of triumph, clearly believing that her appearance meant their plan had succeeded. "Your Highness," Duke Harrison said, his voice carrying across the chamber despite the continued chanting and the ominous sounds rising from the pool. "You've arrived at the perfect moment. The ancient cycle is about to reach its completion." Charlotte walked slowly toward the pool, outwardly calm, but inwardly racing through the steps of the ritual Isabel had taught her. The permanent binding required precise timing and absolute focus, and she would have to begin the process while surrounded by enemies who would try to stop her the moment they realized what she was actually doing. "Duke Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her royal position, "I understand that my family has carried this burden for many generations. I understand that sacrifices must be made to protect the kingdom. Indeed, Your Highness, your noble bloodline has been the guardian of this realm for centuries. Tonight, you will take your place in that grand tradition." Charlotte could see the shapes rising in the pool more clearly now. They were massive, far larger than the human-like faces she had glimpsed before. These were the true forms of the first ones, beings of shadow and hunger that defied rational description. Some appeared to be made of writhing tentacles that ended in clusters of eyes. Others looked like geometric impossibilities that hurt to perceive directly. "Before I fulfill my destiny," Charlotte said, moving closer to the pool's edge, "I would like to understand exactly what will happen. What did my ancestors do in this place? How did they serve the kingdom's needs?" Duke Harrison's smile was cold and predatory. "They entered the pool willingly, Your Highness, offering their life force to maintain the barriers that keep the first ones contained. It is a noble sacrifice that ensures the safety of all humanity. And after I enter the pool, what happens then? The barriers are renewed for another generation. The first ones return to their slumber, and the kingdom enjoys peace and prosperity under their benevolent influence." Charlotte nodded as if accepting this explanation, but she had caught the lie in his words. The first ones were not benevolent in any sense, and their influence would not bring peace to the kingdom. Duke Harrison was planning to offer her as a sacrifice to free them entirely, not to contain them. She reached in her bag and withdrew the meteorite iron blade, holding it openly so everyone in the chamber could see it. This blade was blessed by the original founders of our kingdom, she announced. It has been passed down through the royal line specifically for this moment. Several of the robed figures exchanged glances, clearly uncertain whether this was part of their expected ceremony or something else entirely. Your Highness, Duke Harrison said carefully, the traditional ceremony doesn't require any weapons. But this isn't the traditional ceremony, is it, Duke Harrison? Charlotte replied, her voice carrying a new edge of steel. You're not planning to renew the barriers at all. You're planning to destroy them completely. The chamber fell silent except for the bubbling of the pool and the increasingly loud voices emerging from its depths. Duke Harrison's mask of false loyalty finally slipped, revealing the calculating opportunist beneath. You know, he said simply, somehow you discovered the truth. I know that you've been working for years to weaken the barriers that contain the first ones. I know that the people who disappeared from the northern villages were harvested for their spiritual energy to power your rituals. And I know that you've been planning to use me as the final key to free entities that will destroy everything my family has spent centuries protecting. Duke Harrison laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. Your family has spent centuries as slaves to creatures that should have been freed long ago. The first ones offer knowledge, power, immortality to those wise enough to serve them. They will remake this world into something far grander than the petty kingdom your ancestors have maintained. They will remake it into a hell where human beings exist only to feed their hunger for suffering, Charlotte countered. I've seen their true nature, Duke Harrison. I know what they really are. And yet you're here, he pointed out, standing at the edge of their prison, holding a blade that could easily end your own life. Even knowing the truth, you're still going to play your part in freeing them. Charlotte smiled, and for the first time since entering the chamber, Duke Harrison looked uncertain. You're right, she said. I'm going to use this blade, but not in the way you expect. She raised the meteorite iron knife and drew it across her palm, allowing her blood to drip into the churning pool. But instead of continuing with the ritual that would free the first ones, she began to speak in a different ancient language, the words Isabel had taught her for the permanent binding. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The blue-white flames of the candles around the chamber suddenly flared red, and the symbols on the walls began to pulse with a different rhythm. The voices from the pool changed from triumphant roars to screams of rage and frustration. Stop her! Duke Harrison shouted, but his followers seemed frozen by the sudden change in the chamber's atmosphere. Charlotte continued the incantation, pouring her will and her life force into words that had been crafted centuries ago, but never spoken. She could feel the ritual taking hold, could sense the ancient bindings that held the first ones beginning to shift from temporary containment to permanent imprisonment. But she could also feel the cost. Each word of the incantation drained something vital from her, something that she would never be able to recover. She was not just offering her blood to power the ritual. She was offering her very essence, her humanity, her future. Duke Harrison finally broke free from his paralysis and lunged toward her, but Charlotte was ready. She spun away from his grasping hands and continued the incantation while backing around the pool's perimeter. The first ones beneath the surface were thrashing wildly now, their forms becoming more solid as they desperately tried to break free before the new bindings could take hold. "You don't understand what you're doing," Duke Harrison screamed, pursuing her around the pool. "If you complete that ritual, you'll doom yourself to an existence worse than death. You'll become a living anchor, conscious but trapped forever in a state between life and death." "I know," Charlotte replied calmly, not pausing in her incantation. "But I'll also be saving every other person in this kingdom from sharing that fate. The cycle of sacrifice ends with me." She reached the halfway point of the ritual, and the chamber began to shake more violently. Cracks appeared in the walls, and several of the stone statues around the pool's edge crumbled to dust. The pool itself was starting to freeze, not with ice, but with something that looked like crystallized light. Duke Harrison made another desperate lunge, this time catching Charlotte's arm and trying to wrestle the blade away from her. But as he touched her, something unexpected happened. The ritual's power flowed through their contact, and Duke Harrison screamed as he was caught in the binding force himself. "No," he gasped, his body beginning to shimmer and fade. This was never supposed to. Charlotte felt pity for him. Despite everything he had done, he had been seduced by the promises of the first ones, manipulated by beings who viewed human ambition as a useful tool. In the end, he was as much a victim as anyone else. "I'm sorry," she said sincerely, then spoke the final words of the permanent binding ritual. The chamber exploded with light, not the sickly glow of the first one's influence, but pure, clean radiance that seemed to come from the very heart of creation itself. Charlotte felt herself being lifted off her feet, her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of her physical form. In that moment of transformation, she could see everything, the true history of her kingdom, the noble intentions and terrible compromises of her ancestors, the lives that had been saved and lost over 12 generations of royal sacrifice. She could see the first ones as they truly were, beings of such alien hunger and malice that their very existence threatened the fundamental order of reality. And she could see the new bindings taking hold, wrapping around the first ones like chains forged from starlight. And these bindings would not weaken with time or require renewal through sacrifice. They were permanent, absolute, eternal. But the price was everything she had been and everything she might have become. When the light finally faded, the chamber was silent and empty except for a pool of perfectly clear, still water and a single figure standing at its edge. Charlotte remained, but she was no longer entirely human. Her form was translucent, neither fully solid nor completely incorporeal. She was alive, but not living, present, but existing in a state removed from normal reality. The robed followers of Duke Harrison had vanished, dissolved by the ritual's power. Duke Harrison himself was gone, consumed by the very forces he had tried to control. The symbols on the walls had changed, no longer depicting the binding of the first ones, but rather their eternal imprisonment. Charlotte looked down at her changed form and felt no regret. She had broken a cycle of horror that had lasted for centuries, ensuring that no future member of her family would face the terrible choice that had defined her bloodline. The kingdom was safe, and, more importantly, it would remain safe forever. Above her, she could hear sounds of confusion and alarm as the palace reacted to the sudden earthquake and the mysterious disappearance of Duke Harrison and his conspirators. Soon, investigations would begin. Stories would be told about the princess who vanished while trying to stop a supernatural threat to the kingdom. But Charlotte knew the truth would eventually be understood, at least by those who needed to know it. Margaret would see to that. Her parents would return to find their kingdom saved and their daughter transformed into something beyond their understanding, but worthy of their pride. In the months that followed, the northern provinces would recover from the mysterious disappearances. The missing people would return, appearing in their villages with no memory of where they had been, but carrying a sense of peace that they couldn't quite explain. The supernatural threats that had plagued the kingdom for generations would become nothing more than old stories told to frighten children. Charlotte remained in the chamber beneath the palace, no longer bound by the needs of her physical form, but not truly free either. She was the eternal guardian, the living seal that ensured the first ones could never again threaten the world above. Sometimes, late at night, palace servants reported seeing a figure in white walking the corridors of the East Wing. They said she looked like Princess Charlotte, but younger somehow, and surrounded by a soft light that made them feel safe even in the darkest hours. Margaret, who lived to be very old and served the royal family faithfully for the rest of her life, always smiled when she heard these stories. She knew that Charlotte had found a way to remain present in the world she had saved, watching over the kingdom she loved even in her transformed state. The cycle of sacrifice had ended, but the love that had motivated it continued, taking on a new form that would endure for as long as the kingdom itself existed. Princess Charlotte had faced the choice that had haunted her bloodline for 12 generations, and she had found a way to transform that burden into something beautiful and eternal. The royal guard would never again have to bring grim news about supernatural threats to the kingdom's safety. The price had been everything, but the reward was worth far more than everything. It was forever.